I'm Nicole Bass. I'm this year's National Vice President. And thanks so much for expressing interest in Austin architecture. We're super excited for today's episode and chat with you.
Great. Nice to meet you. I was National Vice President in 2003.
2000. Oh, we've been talking to so many alumni lately. So 2000, you were before Jake and Trinity.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, we could kind of just get right into it.
Sure.
I always like starting from the beginning. So what sparked your interest in studying and pursuing architecture?
I would say my interest in physics in high school, coupled with I did a lot of like music and creative writing and things, and I was looking for sort of something that would appeal to both sides of my brain in that way. And I think it was a guidance counselor who suggested it, and I was like, oh, that sounds good. I really didn't know what I was doing.
No worries. Sounds lovely. And when you were like looking for schools and things like that, like did you think you were going to stay in your area? Like can you kind of give us some background on like what made you choose a particular school you went to?
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey, and I applied to schools in the Northeast. I guess, I don't know. That's what I did. Um, Actually, I went to Carnegie Mellon, and that was the only 5-year program that I applied to. And again, at the time, didn't really know what I was doing. Um, but in retrospect, I think it was a great thing. And I visited and liked it there, and yeah, there we go.
Absolutely. And speaking about like school and all that, what um what role did like AIS play into it and like what sparked your interest in kind of like, doing things outside of studio?
So AIS played a huge role in my 5 years at Carnegie Mellon. I am always interested in making stuff better, so that's what appealed to me first, I guess. And I'd say that throughout my time there, people involved in AIS who were further along than I was in the program were really, really mentors to me, and a big part of who I became. And I actually did some other stuff on campus. I was in Greek life, and I also was really involved in Habitat for Humanity, and was a big advocate for things outside of studio being important as well. And AIS was a huge part of that.
Absolutely. And want to maybe some name drop some mentors you had and what was kind of some highlighted experiences with them?
Sure. Well, I don't know if anyone knew. Margaret Trampy was a wonderful person who was our chapter president, and then after Margaret was Larry Fabroni, and then after Larry was me, I think, per president. So, and there were several other people who were involved nationally. We also hosted forum when I was a second 5 years. So that was a huge thing to sort of understand outside of our bubble what was going on in the professional world, even as students, and being part of something bigger than just your studio project.
That's amazing. And then so were you chapter president when you
I
hosted
was
forum? Okay.
no, not when we did forum. It was after
Okay.
that. I was
Gotcha.
like, young. Although I
Um,
remember making up the dance for our
yes.
forum, like our pitch at forum, to be the
Hmm.
host. We had
Yeah.
like a whole thing about Steel City Forum and Pittsburgh and the kind of reinvention of Pittsburgh, um, which was really, you look now at what everybody's talking about, and it's actually very similar subjects with regard to sustainability and
Yeah.
resiliency. Um, and so that was in 2001, I think. That I'm pretty.
Yeah. They're they were hosting 4 quad conferences now, and all of them have that like same level of like revitalization or revival or things like that. So kind of like it's always a good topic. have, especially in a conference format. Um, so after, you graduated from Carnegie Mellon, after being chapter president and attending forum, can you tell us a bit about your current role and your journey into it?
Sure. So my first year out of school, I was the national vice president of AIS. And that was awesome. And I'm sure everybody knows, but just how I talk about it now is just that I traveled around the country and was an advocate for students and emerging professionals in architecture. And um, that was a transformative time in which I decided I actually did want to be an architect, which was odd to me because I always thought that my interests kind of with being part of something bigger than studio meant that I wasn't interested in being an architect. But actually, what it was my interest in architecture is really on like kind of the process and business side more than like, not that I'm not a designer and I work for Paycub Freed, which is, a design center practice, and I have to sort of have that sensibility. But like sitting on my own doing drawings doesn't get me going. What gets me going is talking to people, is leading teams, coordination, and quite frankly, going after projects and talking about how great my colleagues are, and why we should do the project. So what I the year after AIS, I came right to Paycom Freed. So that was 18 and a half years ago. I've been here and moved up the ranks, and I'm an associate partner now. And my current role is some sort of like project manager, but I also do some office management stuff, like that's more holistic. I'm a lot involved in a lot of business uh, development, let's call it business development type stuff. Um, and I really like that. I also been speaking at some conferences. My passion and sort of where I want to go is all about repositioning and recladding. And the firm where I work has a strong history of expertise with exterior envelopes, particularly curtain walls. And looking at a lot of the buildings, particularly in New York, where they're all kind of reaching their end of life in terms of their skins, or a lot of them, especially in like the 50s, 60s, even 70s. Looking at those and recladding them, I did a really huge project called 1271 Avenue of the Americas, which I'm really proud of. And I was a project manager for and one of the lead designers. And it really like solidified to me that that's where I know what I'm meant to do. And it was like, I just talked about our forum like 20 years ago that was about sustainability, but then also this kind of technical knowledge that I gained early on at Paycom Freed, sort of merging those two things together. I really think that reuse of buildings in a way that is lucrative for building owners is the key to solving a big chunk of our carbon emissions problem. So that's what I'm trying to only focus on. Of course, that's hard because getting to do a whole building is kind of a holy grail type of project in that regard. But a lot of times it's smaller stuff. It's lobbies and storefronts. And now we're talking a lot about repurposing like office buildings into residential, things like that. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
studies going on, but not a lot of building at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, congratulations. I mean, to stay with a company for so long and rise up the ranks and be an associate partner, like that's like the dream come true for a lot of students of like right, going down that path. And also like yeah, plus one to all of the like sustainability and like reducing carbon footprint. Like even in my studio during the pick of the pandemic, we did a lot of adaptive reuse like studies and literally changing one of like the most iconic midtown skyscrapers into residentials and seeing what that looks like and playing that out in studio and one day hopefully sooner rather than later things like that start happening.
Yeah, I mean, if you
um
think about carbon, I always say that like the building with the smallest carbon footprint is the one that's already built. And thinking about how we can reuse that energy instead of expending new resources is a design challenge and quite frankly, a commercial challenge for a lot of building owners. It's important.
Absolutely. So, even talk like staying on that topic of like, kind of these topics, do you feel like school or like early on in your career like prepped you for like tackling these types of issues? Because I know so many students are interested in like kind of exactly the same work we're talking about, but they're not necessarily seeing that education or training early on in their career as in architecture.
Yeah, well, no, it definitely did. And I think I kind of touched on, I think the combination of things like AIS and sort of realizing um my ability to be a leader. And I always like I joke and say that I'm really good at telling other people what to do, but actually am. No. uh, but the thing about it is like understanding that that is a piece of architecture and actually how a lot of things get done. I've thought a couple times about leaving traditional practice to go do that other places, like with a developer. And I've never, I've gotten close, but I've never actually been able to give up sort of the design studio way of thinking, right? Where it's not, the motivation has to be first and foremost to me, what's the right thing to do more than like what's the economic thing to do. I think it's important to figure out how those things can be economical, but it's kind of the almost the idealism of being an architect that I don't want to give up and go to like the other side. So I'd say that school, studio um, is not as directly related to what I'm doing now, I think, as some of the other things that I did in school. Um, it's funny when you're in studio, you think that like, oh, that person always gets an A in studio. They're going to be like a famous architect. They're not, probably, to be honest. And that's okay. Like, there's lots of things you can do and not wear a black cape, and maybe those things you can do are actually more important than wearing a black cape. So
Absolutely. I always feel like, yeah, studio culture or like at least just like the rankings of studios sometimes gets to people's heads a little too early on, especially when you're like only in first and second year. And it's just like, trust me, there's a whole career ahead of
right.
you. Um,
There are important things about design foundation that I don't
yeah.
want to dismiss. But I'll say when I look at portfolios, for instance,
Hmm.
I don't um, I'm interested in ideas. I'm also interested in how people can produce drawings because that's what I need them to do, right? But in terms of like the nitty gritty of it, that's really important in an academic setting and not so important to me, quite frankly.
That's all right. I think it's everyone has like their hot take, and that's something I'll ask you a little later. And kind of staying on this topic of like, balancing design work, but also like, you know, trying to do better in the world, but also you mentioned like being a PM in an office, doing office management. Or like, how do you continue to balance like, wanting to design, but then also like doing all these other things that make your project run?
I mean, I think that the universal quality is about judgment, actually, your design judgment or your sort of business judgment, your people judgment, right? How you can relate to people. And to me, I've always done my research and asked my questions. And I think those are really important skills no matter what you're doing within the practice. Um, but I do think that I sort of like am designing a team when I think about like staffing, right? And so to me, it is kind of a design problem, and it's about my judgment in that regard. Um, but at the same time, when the hammer comes down and somebody calls and is like, "What are you going to do about this?" Like I have to know technically what's going on. I have to know aesthetically why we did what we did, and I'm fortunate that I work with a lot of amazing people who usually almost always have done the right thing. So, but understanding that is important still.
Absolutely. And it's so nice that you have like an amazing team. I know a lot of students just always want that, like to enter in a team where you're enjoying the project and not feeling like it's a terrible experience.
Yeah.
Um, Kind of jumping questions. With all this time that you spend in the field and post graduation, Who do you look up to in architecture, whether it be women or in general or things like that?
Hmm. That's a hard question for me. So, um, there's a couple people that I would just say from a female perspective, that's an important question to me because I have two young children who are 12 and 6, and my little one has special needs and is neurotypical. And so balancing my personal life has, I used to think it was hard before them, and I had no idea. It's really hard. And there's a couple people. One is Vivian Lofness, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon. And when I was there, I was her TA, and she had little kids, and she was amazing. She was all over it. But sometimes the kids would come to school with her, and I think watching her was actually a really big part of why I feel like I can do it all. And so she's probably one. Another one is a female partner in our office whose name is Yvonne Cito, who um, has this ability to be completely stoic. And that is something that is hard for me because I'm very passionate and I don't necessarily apologize for it like I used to, but I do think there's some value in understanding when it's okay and when it's not. And she's definitely an inspiration. We sort of balance each other out sometimes, I think, because I tend to get a little hot under the collar, and she's much more even, and I always admire that about her.
Yeah, wonderful. I feel like, so many people kind of contribute their like architecture success or just like getting through it by the professors they had. Sometimes you're like really lucky and that professor or group of professors just stay with you kind of forever, for better, for worse.
Right.
So it's always
Yes,
nice
I
to
have some
know.
of those too, but
Yeah, I feel like everyone has, their list, which is, it is what it is. Um, I think also kind of to talk a little bit more about like, your journey overall is like, how was it to, get licensed? Did you ever think of, I know you mentioned moving kind of into the developer world. Have you like thought about even like moving across the world for different firms or like different environments?
so I guess I like the larger firm setting. Pickup Read isn't large firm like how you call them nowadays with hundreds of people, but I sort of like that better than two or three people in the office, just because I feed off the energy of different perspectives, and I really like that. Um, in terms of my journey and sort of moving, I'm from Jersey and I work in New York, and like that's it. My husband's from New York City, so that's pretty much where we are, and we agreed on that. But I do love that I live actually in a old house out in New Jersey that my commute is by train and by foot, and we're restoring this like 1880s house, just like we're just a bunch of sucker architects. Uh, sorry, it's true though.
No, I love
Uh,
it. It's good to hear.
but I'm from here, and I guess I always knew I would come back, even though I went to college in Pittsburgh. So I don't know if that
Yeah,
answers the question.
no, it definitely does. I'll say, at least for me personally, I always struggle with that. I'm like, do I just go back to New York City? Am I like lame for just going back to where I came from? Like, should I just go explore? Should I like risk it? All these things. So it's nice to hear someone else who's like, nope, I'm very clear about my decision. I'm gonna be here. It is what it is. And honestly, it's like what a dream, right? Like you get to renovate your own home and like that's just one so many of New Yorkers' dreams or like tri-state area, but also just yeah, the architect's dream to like renovate their own home or like an old home and make it theirs. So no, I at least I appreciate the answer. What advice would you give to those in high school now, or young architects?
Um, well, those in high school. So after AIS, then I was on the NAB board for 2 years, and understanding now what I do about how architectural education works, it's important to try and understand that. I would say my biggest suggestion would be to look for NAB accredited programs so that you're not putting yourself at a disadvantage, regardless of if you are there for 4+2 or 5 year, whatever it's called at the time, which I've seen it all kind of change over the past 19 years. And then I would say to just ask questions and, as younger, not as emerging professionals are in our office, one of the things I encourage is like, ask me a question. I'd rather have you ask me a question than sit for like 2 days staring at something you don't understand. Um, and that's really, if someone doesn't, even if I say like, look, I got this afternoon's crazy. Can we do that tomorrow morning? Someone who doesn't want to answer your questions is not someone you want to work for. And so much of being an architect is what you learn while you're practicing. And I take that responsibility very seriously and think that, yeah, that's how it should be, right? That's part of our responsibility once we become licensed, is to think about others and how they can get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like all the like the licensed architects I've talked to have been like super supportive, even about like just anything. They're like, we're here for you because like essentially get your license, gain a number. Especially like with NOMA and their 2030 challenge. It's like literally more the merrier, please.
Yeah, exactly. I was at a conference and I won't name names, but someone of the Black Cave said that what he thought was wrong with architecture was that there wasn't enough liberal arts in the degrees, and that you should have like a liberal arts degree first before you get your MArch. And I was like, wow, that's incredibly elitist. And I think people I was really struck by that. And I was like, he has no idea how hard it is for some people to become architects, right? Like the least of our problems is whether you have a Bachelor of Architecture, or a Bachelor of Science or whatever. That's the least of our problems. What's important is that we have different paths for people to get there. And 20 years ago, we were talking about that with AIS and with NAB, and we're still talking about it, but in a way that is more explicit about equality.
Yeah, 100%. And we hear it too in the AIS even nowadays about people gesturing at that type of qualifications. Um, just trying to find like the best words to describe this. But it's been really, I mean, not just as the national vice president currently, but it's been so sweet to just see so many students from so many paths want to even pursue architecture and even lean on AIS, even if like they're not even interested in the chapter, if they're not even like could even sustain a chapter for whatever reason, like they still just want to be like plugged into the network and
Mhm.
just help each other. So like, I don't know. It's it's interesting. Um, cool. And then two more questions. And so second to last is how can our listeners and readers follow you and your projects?
Oh, uh, well, I'm on LinkedIn. Is that what you mean? Is that the kind of?
Yeah, whatever is
Yeah.
like best. I know some people have their own personal websites or I don't know.
Oh, I'm just on LinkedIn, and we have an office website that talks about our projects. I also post whenever I'm like involved in a conference or something too. So,
Oh, all right. Lovely. And then the last question, which I always love to end off with, is, and I know we talked about a few topics already, but what's your hottest take on architecture?
my hottest,
Hmm.
like, what's my pet peeve, or like, what's my?
Like it, however you want to interpret it. Pet peeve
Course, I
also
would think of
works.
it kind of negative. No, hmm. Well, so I guess probably um just what we can learn from what I'm interested in right now, for my practice, is what we can learn from the younger generation in terms of work-life balance and what it means to be healthy. When I was involved in AIS, it was like during the first studio culture task force. And we talked a lot about sort of the positive values of studio rather than some of the negatives, and that was really there's anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail, but um we talked about that, but in a way it never really got anywhere, right? Because we still were doing the same things that that the generation before us did, as much as we, were involved in other things outside of studio. I mean, a lot of people I know, their superpowers that they don't have to sleep. And I think what I'm learning from the younger people that I work with is sort of and what we learned in the pandemic, because we were all working in a different way, um, is like how much smarter it makes you when you have a perspective that is not just like micro focused on your work or your studio or whatever it is. So what I'm interested in right now is understanding work-life balance and how that relates to better work and working smarter, not harder.
I always love that phrase, smarter, not harder. I had the new professors tell this to us many times because we would get like details very wrong. So that was their sweet way of saying redo this for the 10th million time. And I'm like, okay, fine. Um,
No, but
but
it's
yeah,
true. You could spend hours, but if you're not looking at the right thing, then like what's the point of all those hours, right? So
exactly.
um
Uh, definitely. I think I'm still in the high of enjoying a non-studio life. But
mhm.
I'm sure I'll miss it sooner rather than later. A lot of my friends are like applying to grad school now, saying like, I miss studio. And I'm like, I think I need like a few more years before I do that again.
Right.
Um, but yeah, thanks so much for all your answers. And it's just exciting to connect back to another legacy, and thanks for sharing your journey of like post graduation, getting to the position that you're in now, and kind of what your hottest takes were in architecture. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.